Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, we are going to be talking not only about how our education system is so broken, but also what it looks like to fix it, and all of the technologies and tools that have come online over the past years and decades that completely change the game in what's possible in education. We're going to be talking about the history and how we got here. We're going to be talking about the future and what the future of education can and should look like. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. I'm super excited. So I woke up this morning and refrained from going on X for a while. I was behaving myself in my digital hygiene. But when I eventually got on X, one of the first things that I saw was a tweet by a guy named Justin Bader. He was being retweeted by some of the alternative education people that I follow because he had made what is considered to be a very reasonable take in the traditional education community, but is considered to be a very incorrect take in the alternative education world. He said, "Hear me out. Students do not all learn at the same pace, but they should mostly be taught at the same pace. There's something to pace setting. It results in more learning even for kids who aren't fully keeping up because knowledge sticks to knowledge. Teaching all students at the same pace and having some learn more and some learn less is the best possible outcome, as painful as it may be to admit." Okay, so I reposted his post. And I said, only if you're thinking inside the confines of a 30-student, single-teacher classroom with no AI, no internet, and no 20th century technology. I posted it, I closed the app, I got on with my day, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something really important here. When I reopened the app hours later, he had replied to me and said, only if you care about things that actually exist and aren't just homeschool fantasies extrapolated to all of society. And I think this drove home why this original post bothered me so much and why I think it's worth talking about here, because I think it's his original post and my attempt at a reply sum up a lot of thinking on both sides of the aisle when we start talking about what's broken in American education and reform. Most people you talk to agree that education in America is broken, it's not working. And if you start digging through the stats and pulling the literacy rates, the test scores, the math aptitude of students from truly K all the way through 12, it's pretty undeniable that American education has a huge problem. But people are very divided on what exactly is broken and what is possible in order to fix it. And people like Justin are very much in the camp that basically the system is doing the best it can, even though kids in a classroom are not learning at the same pace, and some kids are ahead and are bored, and some kids are behind and don't understand the last lesson that they've been taught, and so aren't grasping at all the lessons that are being taught to them in class currently. It's still the best we can do. And if you're limiting your thinking to the current model that most of us are familiar with, where you have a very large school with many classrooms and students are divided across these classrooms, and most classrooms have roughly 30 students with a single teacher at the front of the classroom teaching to all of those 30 students at the same time, regardless of the exact level that they're at, he's right that inside of that system, if that's the only thing that is possible, some kids being a little bit ahead and some kids being a little bit behind is the best we can do, because not every kid learns at the same pace and not every kid grasps every lesson. And so in a normal classroom, and there have been many studies that have been done on this is commonly accepted knowledge, students develop learning gaps, basically holes in their knowledge, where they're moving through a progression of concepts that are all intended to build on each other. Math is a very good example of this because acquisition of mathematical knowledge is very linear. You start with basic addition and subtraction. You add multiplication and division on top of that. You start dealing with things like fractions and decimals and percentages. And in order to work with these more complex groupings of numbers, you have to understand basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division in order to be able to level up your skills and execute those types of tasks on more complex groupings of numbers. If a child struggles to understand any stage of this process, they move along with the rest of the class to the next level, but they're missing core understandings and core skills that allow them to adeptly execute the work that's being done at the next level, which means that they can progress through the entire sequence starting in kindergarten and first grade math all the way through high school and technically pass every grade level because a 60 to 70% is a passing grade, but have big holes in their knowledge, which if you think of the knowledge as being built, each level is like a story in a building. And if you are actually building a building and you have gaps in the structure of each floor, you have walls that are missing or support beams that were never properly installed, the more you build on top of each subsequent broken layer, the more wobbly the entire structure gets. And in the same vein, when kids progress through each grade level and have gaping holes in their knowledge, the entire structure of their knowledge and understanding and capacity becomes more and more unstable. But when you're trapped inside the model of 30 kids to a classroom and one teacher teaching the entire class, you don't really have a choice. This is a negative outcome that you kind of have to accept because when you're dealing with the scale of a large school district, to some extent, you can group kids based on their aptitudes. So you can get some approximation of every kid being on the same level. You're grouping your gifted kids together. You're grouping your kids together who need additional remedial support. But even then, not every kid is learning on the exact same timeline continuum. And not every kid is struggling with the same things because kids are individuals and each one's learning process is unique. And so each kid inevitably ends up with gaps in their knowledge where they needed additional support that their teacher couldn't give them because it would have held up the rest of the class. If you have 30 kids in a classroom, probably in every single lesson, at least one kid could use a little extra time on the subject to really grasp it. But there's not time to address that for every child. And so inevitably in every lesson, some child is getting not quite exactly the dialed in level of support that they really could use to truly grasp and master a subject. And so they end up with lots of little gaps along the way that become very big gaps, even in the best performing classrooms in the country. So yes, if you are assuming that this is the best model for delivering education to kids, then yes, this kind of is what we have to accept. I quote again, teaching all students at the same pace and having some learn more and some learn less is the best possible outcome, as painful as it may be to admit. If you are limiting the possibilities to a teacher in front of a 30-student classroom model, then yes, this is a painful reality that you have to accept. But those of us in the alternative education world refuse to accept that this is the best possible way to educate kids, both in terms of it being the pinnacle of how education ought to be delivered, but also it being the pinnacle of logistically and financially how we can afford to educate our kids. We reject the model altogether. And the proof is there that other models work, they exist, the results are phenomenal, and they're becoming more and more scalable, especially as technologies like AI come more and more online. And that's what I want to talk about here. What the future of education looks like if we are harnessing the tools that are at our fingertips. Justin's reply to my quote tweet is also very telling, where he says, only if you care about things that actually exist and aren't just homeschool fantasies extrapolated to all of society. This is really important because when those of us in the alternative education world start talking about other options, a lot of people write it off as privilege or delusion or having blinders on about where selectively these ideas work and where they don't. And I think a lot of the arguments about alternatives get very quickly dismissed because it's just assumed that they couldn't possibly work across society at large. But again, the data is starting to accrue that no matter where it is put into practice, these alternative modalities of educating kids work. They are effective. The test scores are almost unilaterally phenomenally better than those that come out of the traditional model. And logistically, it is possible to educate kids, no matter the circumstances, no matter the geographic location, in ways besides just having a teacher in front of the classroom. So that's what we're talking about today. First, though, a little bit of historical context, because I don't think we talk enough about the divide between 20th century education and 21st century education. And we don't talk about it because, in large part, in practice, it doesn't exist, with the exception of the intense stress and pressure that is put on test prep, which has exploded enormously in public school classrooms over the past couple of decades. There isn't a lot of difference between a classroom in the 1980s or the 1990s and a classroom in the 2010s or the 2020s. And that's crazy because the world as we know it is wildly different in so many other capacities. And the technologies that have come online to make the world wildly different could and should also apply to education. The world that public school as we know it was designed for was a very different world. There was no internet. Most families didn't have a personal phone line. By necessity, knowledge had to be transmitted in person, and institutions that housed knowledge, both the individuals who were tasked with conveying it and the books that contained it, were necessary for people to gather at a central geographic location to transmit that knowledge and to learn things. That world no longer exists. The internet, when it first came online in universities, and it was designed to allow professors and students at different universities to communicate information to each other. The internet is primarily a tool of information transfer, and knowledge is information. The things that kids learn in school are information. We have tools of knowledge transfer that exist that did not exist when our education system, which is a system of knowledge transfer, came online. But the system has never been updated. Yes, we have added internet into schools. Schools have computers, but they haven't updated the model itself. And the entire model is predicated on the fact that the only way for kids to learn is for them to have a physical teacher in front of them in a physical classroom communicating information. But that's not true anymore. And yet the entire model still rests on the structure of having kids grouped in classrooms with a teacher who is primarily teaching them with the support of books, but primarily teaching them through verbally communicating knowledge, lecturing to them, teaching them. That model isn't necessary anymore, but it also isn't the best option anymore. Things have been designed and built that are better than this model. And yet somehow, as a culture, we still assume that this is the only option we've got for educating our kids. For well over 50 years, study after study has been completed on what we call learning science, basically the science of how we learn. These studies have come out of all of the leading universities around the country, and they have shown that students learn best when they are able to pace the acquisition of knowledge based on mastery. What this means is that when a student learns a new concept, they do not move on to the next concept until they have mastered the first one. This approach treats knowledge as iterative, which in many subjects it is. There's a progression that you need to move through. You need the underlying foundational building blocks to move on to the next package of information. But it also recognizes that a student's performance will drop as they get into later and later material if they didn't master the things that came at the beginning. These studies also very clearly demonstrate that there are techniques that students can use to increase and speed up the level of mastery. Things like spaced repetition and active recall. When they learn a new subject, then they move on to engage with some other materials, and then they come back to that first subject again and are quizzed on it, and they have to actively recall the information after a space, a gap, where their mind has filed it away and then has to reaccess it. That's how the neural pathways get built to internalize and memorize information. All of these strategies are very intuitive, and they're things that a lot of us already know. If you've ever used flashcards to memorize a topic or to study for a test, you're basically using active recall and spaced repetition. You learn the material, you copy it onto a flashcard, you give yourself a little bit of space, and then you force your brain to remember what's on the flashcard. And each time you do that, you more and more deeply reinforce the material. According to learning science, everything should be taught this way. But it's not possible in a classroom where every child is learning at a different pace, because for best results, these spaced repetitions and this active recall needs to focus on a specific subset of material until that material has actually been mastered. And kids take wildly different amounts of time to master different things. And so kids in a classroom can't all progress through material at the same time. What is really good at delivering spaced repetition and active recall and mastery-based learning is AI and LLMs. AI is uniquely good at taking the information that a child needs to know, packaging it into a lesson, presenting it to the child, presenting them with a quiz, assessing how they did on the quiz, and then immediately creating a new lesson that reinforces the things that the student struggled most at and most needs to learn. This isn't some crazy sci-fi idea. This already exists. There are a large number of educational programs and online apps that are designed to teach kids everything from the Common Core subjects like grammar and reading and math, all the way through to more elective sciences that are built using LLMs and AI. And there are programs like 2-Hour Learning, which is based in Austin, Texas, that are designed to deliver an entire K-12 education using only this AI-driven model of mastery-based learning that kids can do entirely working through the computer screen without a teacher in the room at all, in, as the name suggests, only 2 hours a day. Because not only is it better from a mastery standpoint for kids to work at a self-directed pace, but also it's good from an efficiency standpoint, because when kids aren't held back by other kids in their classroom who are learning more slowly and that require a teacher to move at a steady pace through each subject in the curriculum, if a kid's grasping something really quickly, they can just move past it and on to the next thing, which over time averages out to kids spending way less time on their schoolwork than they do in a traditional classroom. AI is still a really new technology, but in the same way that the birth of the internet took the geographic necessities of public school out of the equation because now people could access information from anywhere in the world with an internet connection, AI is taking the teaching component out of public school education because it's able to present information to students in a linear and logical and progressive manner that allows them to move through all of the things that they need to know in a customized and mastery-based process that eliminates the need of a teacher in front of the classroom communicating information. So not only do we not need the physical location of school from an information transfer standpoint, but now we also don't need the teacher anymore. This gets a lot of pushback from people because there are concerns about kids needing the human element of a teacher. There's the childcare component. If kids aren't in school all day, who's going to be taking care of them while their parents are at work? But again, the world is a very different place than it used to be. Remote work is suddenly commonplace. And lots of families have at least one parent working from home who doesn't necessarily have the time and energy to be homeschooling the kids, but can be the adult presence in the space to make sure the kids are okay while they're getting their schooling through an online model. But I'm not just a proponent of online education. I'm actually think that for a lot of kids, that's not the best option. But I am a proponent of the types of education models that become possible when you're no longer limited to kids being grouped by exact grade level and aptitude level in a classroom with a teacher who is pacing the class through a progression of material all at the same time in the hopes that everybody learns enough to pass at the end of the year. And that takes most of the kids' time sort of collectively moving them through the process instead of letting each kid move through the progression at their own pace and have most of their time left free for things that actually matter to them or for just being a kid. Imagine a classroom that has 10 students in it, and those 10 students are spread across 4 different grade levels. There are third graders in this room. There are sixth graders in this room. There is an adult in the room, but that adult is not teaching the kids. The kids are all on their iPads or their laptops, and they're each independently working through their academic material for the day. Some of them are doing math, some of them are doing English. They're all going to hit all the different subjects, but they're allowed to hit them in the order that best serves them. And the adult in the room isn't the one who's responsible for conveying the academic knowledge. She's the coach, she's the facilitator, she's the mentor. If the kids get stuck on their schoolwork, she's there to help them. But most of the time, her job is helping kids find the materials that they need. It's talking to the kids about their goals and helping them strategize their schedule. It's talking to them about the things that they want to learn about and then helping them find opportunities to go find resources to consume or get real-world experience learning about these things that interest them. She's much more coach and mentor than she is actual teacher. The room in question that all of these students are in might not be a classroom as you would imagine it at all. It might be a living room. It might be a community space inside of a church. It might be a storefront in a strip mall or at the bottom of a building on a downtown city block. This model that I am describing exists all over the country, and it's growing very rapidly. It's called a microschool, and it's become a sort of phenomenon in the alternative education world. Lots of public school teachers are leaving their jobs to start microschools because they're so fed up with the system, and lots of families are banding together to start a microschool of their own and hire a teacher because they want to have a student-centric education for their kids that just isn't possible inside of the traditional model. These schools are viable, they're relatively affordable, they deliver strong academic outcomes on average to their students, and they exist all over the country. Kids are going to microschools in all 50 states and all major cities today. They are in microschools right now as you are listening to this, and they're getting a great education. But this is just scratching the surface still of what is possible in the 21st century with the tools that we have at our fingertips. There are very large schools that are being established that will be running an AI-driven curriculum for their students, but will have the community resources of having 1,000 student body as opposed to the 10 in a micro school classroom. I'm a huge fan of the idea of companies launching micro schools or communities launching micro schools. Last year, I visited a Guidepost Montessori location in Chicago that was on the ground floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise, and many of the kids in their student body lived in the upper floors of the building, and their parents would bring them down the elevator to school every morning. And it was a very community-centric learning experience. When each kid has a personalized AI tutor that is delivering the academic materials to them at their pace, you don't have to have every kid in the classroom learning at differing paces and just sort of sucking it up. It's not necessary in the 21st century with the technology that we have online, and there is no reason for us to be accepting this as the base standard of what education ought to look like, except for the fact that it's sort of grandfathered in. We have this huge bureaucratic system that is built on the back of this model, and it's so expensive and difficult to change, and so many entrenched interests would lose their positioning if it were to change, that we just sort of keep plodding along. We're a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and we're still educating our kids in a 20th century model, one that doesn't serve them, one that's inefficient, and one that's quite frankly ineffective. The 20th century education model should be dead, and we don't have to accept the pains and the struggles and the drawbacks of that 20th century model if we don't want to. The world will catch up eventually. It's just a matter of how fast. But despite the huge monopoly that public education has, the world of education is still a free market, and lots of parents are opting out of the pains of the 20th century bureaucratic education system to go find alternatives that are student-centric and are student-driven. And if you are a parent, you don't have to settle for the drawbacks of the public school system. You don't have to settle for your kid learning at a pace that doesn't suit them because it's convenient for the teacher and it's necessary for the rest of the class. If you want something better for your kid, it exists, and you do have the power to go find it. And as someone who is a product herself of growing up homeschooled, who was not subjected to the public education system, and who thanks her parents probably on a monthly basis for that, even well into her adulthood, I would highly encourage you to do so. All right, that's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next week.